Imagine a place where silence costs $97,000 a year per person to maintain, where 18 inches of reinforced concrete separate human beings not just from freedom, but from sound itself, where the most expensive prison cells in American history, costing more per square foot than luxury penthouses, house men in spaces smaller than parking spots. This is Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, built in 1989 for $478 million. California's ultimate solution to prison violence, a concrete cathedral of control where revolutionary ideas were supposed to die in isolation. But something unprecedented happened in these 8 by 10-foot tombs. Instead of breaking the Black Guerrilla family, absolute isolation perfected them. Men who couldn't speak to each other for years developed a communication system that moved through concrete walls. Inmates who were supposed to go insane in solitary instead achieved a collective consciousness that organized the most sophisticated prison operation in American history. The state spent nearly $500 million to build the perfect cage. What they created instead was a laboratory for the evolution of resistance, where concrete became curriculum, silence became strategy, and the most monitored prisoners in America coordinated actions that no surveillance system could detect. Today, we open the classified files on how America's most secure prison accidentally became its most dangerous, how the architecture of control became the blueprint for revolution, and how the most expensive silence money can buy taught desperate men to speak a language that concrete couldn't contain. This is the story California doesn't want you to hear. The forensic anatomy of how perfect imprisonment creates perfect revolutionaries. The year was 1966, and California's prison yards looked nothing like they do today. At San Quentin, men walked freely across vast stretches of concrete under open sky. The walls were high, yes, but inside those walls, movement flowed like water finding its level. Inmates gathered in loose clusters, some by race, some by geography, some by the simple human need for conversation after months of silence in their cells. The architecture of these older prisons told a different story than what would come. Built in the 1850s, San Quentin's central yard stretched nearly 2 football fields in length. Men could see from one end to the other, could watch the bay through the windows of the Industries building, could feel wind that had traveled across water just minutes before. The concrete beneath their feet was poured thick, but not oppressive. It was a foundation, not a ceiling. In the shadow of the North Cell block, a group of black inmates often gathered near the basketball courts. They talked about many things: appeals, commissary prices, news from the outside. But increasingly they talked about revolution. Not the kind that toppled governments, though that too was discussed, but the revolution of consciousness that was spreading through black communities across America. Malcolm X had been dead for a year, but his words lived on in letters smuggled past the mail censors. Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence felt distant here, where violence was currency and protection meant everything. What the guards noticed, when they bothered to take notes, was the absence of formal organization. These weren't gangs in any recognizable sense. No territory was claimed with blood, no colors were worn, no initiation rituals were performed in shower stalls or yard corners. Instead, ideas moved through conversation. Marx's theories of class struggle, Fanon's writings on the psychology of oppression, Lenin's thoughts on revolutionary organization. Books were passed hand to hand until they fell apart, then their contents were passed mouth to ear until memory itself became a library. The California Department of Corrections kept meticulous records in those days, and those records reveal something that would later prove crucial. Incidents of gang violence actually decreased in the mid-1960s. Racial tensions existed, certainly, but they expressed themselves through brief flare-ups rather than sustained campaigns. Men settled disputes with fists rather than knives, and disputes themselves seemed to follow older, almost ritualistic patterns: quick, brutal, then over. But the authorities were not reassured by this relative calm. In Sacramento, politicians spoke of rising crime rates and social disorder spilling into the prison system. Outside the walls, the Black Panthers were forming. The anti-war movement was gaining momentum. and young people across the nation seemed to be questioning every assumption their elders had made about authority, race, and the American dream. Inside the walls, officials worried that this questioning spirit would take root in soil already rich with grievance. The problem, as the administrators saw it, was contamination. Political ideas were spreading like viruses through the general population. Men who had entered prison as simple thieves or drug dealers were emerging as revolutionaries, or at least as men who spoke the language of revolution. The solution seemed obvious: separate the infected from the healthy. Remove the ideological leaders from the general population before their ideas could spread further. And so, in conference rooms far from the concrete and steel, a new philosophy began to take shape: isolation as prevention, silence as cure. If revolutionary ideas spread through contact, then contact itself must be eliminated. If leadership required communication, then communication must be severed. If the problem was ideological contamination, then the solution was quarantine, permanent, total, and absolute. The mathematics of this philosophy seemed compelling. Housing a single inmate in administrative segregation cost roughly 3 times what it cost to house him in general population, but preventing a riot could save millions in damages, over time, and liability. Better to spend $60,000 a year, in 1960s money, keeping one man locked away 23 hours a day than to risk the chaos that his influence might unleash. But there was a fatal flaw in this logic, though it would take years to reveal itself. The planners assumed that ideology was like a fire: starve it of oxygen and it would die. They failed to consider that some ideas burn brighter under pressure, that isolation could become incubation, that silence could sharpen rather than dull the revolutionary edge. The first administrative segregation units were modest affairs, a dozen cells carved from existing space, little more than holding areas for inmates awaiting transfer or disciplinary hearing. But by 1968, demand was growing. Not because more inmates were breaking rules, but because more inmates were being classified as politically dangerous. The definition of this danger was broad and subjective. An inmate found with communist literature might find himself transferred to segregation. An inmate who spoke too eloquently about prison conditions might follow. An inmate who seemed to command too much respect from his peers would certainly qualify. The cells themselves were simple concrete boxes, 10 feet by 8 feet, with steel doors that closed with the finality of a bank vault. A narrow window, if there was one at all, looked out onto another concrete wall, a steel toilet bolted to the floor, a concrete slab for a bed, nothing more. The intent was pure functionality, a space designed to hold a human body while giving that body nothing to do, nothing to see, nothing to engage with except the slow passage of time. What the designers failed to anticipate was that the human mind, when stripped of external stimulation, turns inward with extraordinary intensity. Without books to read, men memorized entire works they had read years earlier. Without conversation partners, they held detailed discussions with themselves, refining their arguments, testing their logic, building elaborate philosophical systems that could withstand any challenge because they had already withstood the ultimate challenge: complete solitude. In the isolation cells, time moved differently. Without the rhythms of work details or yard time, without the ability to see sunrise or sunset, inmates created their own temporal structures. Some divided their days into hour-long meditation sessions. Others invented complex exercise routines that could be performed in 8 square feet of floor space. Still others developed memory techniques that transformed their cells into vast mental libraries, where every book they had ever read could be recalled in perfect detail. And in these mental libraries, revolutionary theory found its most fertile ground. Marx's analysis of capitalism took on new meaning for men who could see, with perfect clarity, how their own bodies had become commodities in the prison economy. Lenin's writings on revolutionary organization gained new relevance for men who understood, perhaps for the first time, the true power of the state to isolate and control. Malcolm X's evolution from street criminal to revolutionary intellectual offered a template that many found irresistible. By 1970, The administrative segregation units that had been designed to prevent the spread of radical ideas were becoming instead revolutionary seminaries. Men entered these cells angry and confused. They emerged, if they emerged, with a clear analysis of their situation and a detailed plan for changing it. The isolation that was meant to break them had instead given them time to think, to plan, to imagine possibilities that would never have occurred to them in the chaos of the general population. In the spring of 1971, a group of black inmates at San Quentin founded what they called the Black Guerrilla family. The name itself was significant, not the Black Guerrilla Gang, which would have implied a territorial criminal organization, but the Black Guerrilla family, which suggested something deeper and more enduring. A family bound not by geography or mutual protection, but by shared ideology and common purpose. The BGF, as it came to be known, was from the beginning something unprecedented in the American prison system. Its founding documents, hastily written on strips of toilet paper and smuggled between cells, read more like revolutionary manifestos than gang constitutions. The organization's stated goals included not just survival inside the prison walls, but the eventual overthrow of the capitalist system that had created those walls. Members swore allegiance not to a leader or territory, but to the principles of Marxism-Leninism and the liberation of all oppressed peoples. What made the BGF particularly dangerous, from the administration's perspective, was its recruitment strategy. Other prison gangs recruited based on race, geography, or criminal background. The BGF recruited based on political consciousness. It sought out men who could think, who could read, who could articulate the connection between their personal circumstances and larger social forces. It wanted revolutionaries, not soldiers, and it found them increasingly among the men who had been isolated in administrative segregation. The very inmates that the system had tried to quarantine were becoming the nucleus of something far more dangerous than anything the authorities had imagined. They had been given time to think, and they had used that time to think revolutionary thoughts. They had been given silence, and they had filled that silence with the sound of their own voices planning the downfall of everything their captors represented. The irony was lost on no one except, perhaps, the officials who had designed the system. In trying to prevent the spread of radical ideas, they had created the perfect conditions for those ideas to flourish. In trying to silence revolutionary voices, they had given those voices the time and space they needed to find their full power. In trying to break the connection between political leaders and their potential followers, they had forged something stronger than connection. They had forged belief. By the end of 1971, the Black Guerrilla family had established cells not just at San Quentin, but at every major prison in California. The organization's structure mirrored what its members had read about successful revolutionary movements. Small, disciplined cells that operated independently but in coordination with a central leadership. Communication flowed not through casual conversation, but through coded messages and ritual phrases that could be passed through the most heavily monitored environments. The administrators watched this development with growing alarm. Their solution, more isolation, stricter controls, longer periods in segregation, only seemed to make the problem worse. Each new restriction created new grievances. Each new grievance provided new material for revolutionary analysis. Each new analysis strengthened the conviction that the system itself was the enemy, and that only radical action could change it. And so the stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape not just California's prison system, but the very concept of punishment in America. On one side stood a revolutionary organization born in isolation, nurtured by silence, and tempered by the kind of suffering that either breaks men completely or transforms them into something unrecognizable. On the other side stood a prison system that had invested millions of dollars and decades of planning in the belief that human beings could be controlled through the application of enough concrete and steel. The question that neither side fully understood was not who would win this confrontation, but what both sides would become in the process of fighting it. The Black Guerrilla family had been created by the prison system's attempt to silence revolutionary ideas. Now the prison system would be transformed by its attempt to contain what it had created. In the administrative segregation units across California, men sat in their 8 by 10-foot cells and planned the revolution that would begin not with the overthrow of the government, but with the transformation of the very buildings that held them. They had been given concrete boxes designed to break their spirits. Instead, they would turn those boxes into laboratories for a new kind of human being, one that could not be broken, could not be silenced, and could not be contained by any amount of steel or stone that the state might bring to bear. The architecture of control was about to meet the architecture of resistance, and the collision would reshape both beyond all recognition. 4:30 in the morning, the hour when the California correctional system wakes up 68,000 human beings with the mechanical precision of a factory shift change. In the security housing units across the state, steel doors unlock in sequence, powered by hydraulic systems that consume enough electricity to light a small town. The sound begins at the north end of each cell block and rolls south like thunder, metal against metal against metal, a percussion that marks the beginning of another day in the most expensive silence money can buy. At Pelican Bay, the morning count starts in darkness. 264 men housed in cells that measure exactly 8 feet by 10 feet, smaller than most parking spaces, each one costing the state $97,000 annually to maintain. The mathematics are precise. The economics are staggering. The purpose is absolute control. Guard Roberts has worked this unit for 11 years. He moves down the corridor with practiced efficiency, shining his flashlight through each food port, counting bodies that have become as familiar to him as inventory. The men inside know the routine. They position themselves where the light can reach them, silent acknowledgement of a ritual that has repeated 24,000 times since this facility opened its doors. The architecture of the security housing unit was designed by men who studied the science of human containment with the dedication of engineers building space capsules. Every surface serves a purpose. The concrete walls are poured 18 inches thick, not because 18 inches are necessary to prevent escape, but because 18 inches absorb sound completely. Conversations die in the concrete. Screams never reach the next cell. Even silence has weight here, pressing down with the accumulated mass of thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. The lighting system operates on precisely controlled cycles. Fluorescent tubes mounted behind steel mesh flood each cell with 600-foot candles of illumination during designated day hours, bright enough to prevent the gradual blindness that develops in perpetual darkness, not bright enough to allow the deep sleep that might provide psychological escape. At night, the lights dim but never disappear entirely. Shadows exist here, but darkness does not. Cell 47 houses a man who has been locked in this 8 by 10-foot space for 7 years, 3 months and 16 days. He stopped counting months ago, but his body keeps its own calendar. The fluorescent hum has become the soundtrack to his existence. 60 cycles per second, a mechanical heartbeat that never varies, never stops. He knows that when the lights flicker, it means the diesel generators are switching over. When the ventilation system cycles, it means the hour has changed. His universe has shrunk to the size of a bathroom stall, but within that space he has learned to read time with the precision of an atomic clock. The steel doors that seal these cells weigh 1,400 pounds each. They close with hydraulic pressure sufficient to crush bone, controlled by a central command system that could have been borrowed from a missile silo. When a door closes in the security housing unit, it seals with rubber gaskets that create an almost perfect acoustic barrier. The man in cell 47 can hear his neighbor only when that neighbor screams, and only then as a distant echo that might be mistaken for wind through concrete. The food delivery system operates like clockwork. 3 times daily, steel trays slide through slots designed by engineers who calculated the minimum aperture required for nutrition transfer while preventing the passage of contraband or weapons. The meals arrive at precisely 7:15, 11:30, and 4:45. The timing never varies. The portions are measured to the gram. The temperature is monitored to ensure that food arrives neither hot enough to be weaponized, nor cold enough to constitute cruel punishment. In cell 47, breakfast consists of 4 ounces of scrambled eggs, 2 slices of bread, 1 packet of margarine, and 8 ounces of milk. The nutritional content has been calculated by state dietitians to provide exactly 2,000 calories daily, sufficient to maintain health, insufficient to build strength. The man inside has eaten this same breakfast 1,937 times. He no longer tastes it. His body processes it mechanically, converting state-approved protein into energy for another day of existence that serves no purpose except its own continuation. The shower schedule allows each man 15 minutes of hot water 3 times weekly. The shower stalls are constructed of poured concrete with drains that prevent flooding but collect everything else. The water temperature is controlled remotely, heated to exactly 105 degrees. Hot enough for hygiene, not hot enough for the scalding attacks that plagued earlier generations of maximum security facilities. The soap is dispensed by machines that measure precisely 1 ounce per shower. The towels are counted in and counted out with the obsessive attention to detail that characterizes every aspect of life in the SHU. But something unexpected happens in these showers, something the architects never anticipated. In 15 minutes of hot water, men remember what it feels like to be human. The steam softens the concrete. The warmth penetrates skin that has forgotten the touch of sunlight. And in those 15 minutes, 3 times weekly, the psychological architecture of control reveals its first crack. The man in cell 47 uses his shower time to remember. Not the crimes that brought him here, not the appeals that have failed, not the family that has stopped writing letters. He remembers the feeling of rain, the weight of clothing that fits properly, the sound of traffic from streets he will never walk again. These memories are contraband more dangerous than any weapon, and the shower stall is where he stores them, where the steam helps preserve what the concrete is designed to erode. The mail system operates under protocols that transform correspondence into archaeology. Letters arrive opened, read, copied, and filed in folders that no one except the censors will ever see. The man in cell 47 receives an average of 2 letters monthly, down from 7 during his first year. The decline follows a predictable pattern documented in studies that track the gradual abandonment of men who disappear into administrative segregation. Families fade. Friends forget. Love calcifies under the weight of concrete and time. The letters that do arrive are stripped of their emotional content through surgical redaction. References to shared memories are blacked out as potential code. Expressions of longing are censored as security risks. Promises of future reunions are eliminated as threats to institutional order. What remains are fragments, weather reports, mundane updates, expressions of affection so generic they could have been written to anyone. In cell 47, these fragments become archaeological artifacts. The man inside has memorized every unredacted word from every letter received in 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. He arranges them into conversations with people who have stopped writing, creates narratives from paragraphs that were never meant to connect, builds a fantasy family from scraps of censored correspondence. The fantasy is more real to him now than the actual people who wrote the letters, more present than the guards who count him twice daily, more substantial than the concrete walls that define his universe. The exercise yard allocated to security housing unit inmates exists in a universe of carefully calculated compromise. 20 feet by 30 feet of concrete surrounded by walls 20 feet high, larger than their cells, but not large enough to run. Open to the sky, but not large enough to feel free. The walls block all view of the horizon, creating a rectangular tunnel of daylight that serves the constitutional requirement for fresh air while maintaining the psychological architecture of absolute containment. Exercise period lasts exactly 1 hour, administered 3 times weekly, according to schedules designed to prevent contact between inmates. The man in cell 47 exercises alone, as he has for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. He has worn a track in the concrete from walking the perimeter, 20 feet, 20 feet, 20 feet, 20 feet, 420,000 laps that equal the distance from California to New York and back again. He has never moved more than 30 feet in any direction, but he has walked across America in his concrete box, one step at a time. The psychological studies conducted by state contractors reveal patterns that repeat with scientific precision. Month 1. Adjustment phase, characterized by anger and disorientation. Month 6. Depression phase marked by sleep disturbance and loss of appetite. Month 12. Adaptation phase featuring reduced emotional response and increased psychological rigidity. Month 24. What researchers delicately term environmental adaptation syndrome, a condition indistinguishable from the learned helplessness observed in laboratory animals subjected to inescapable stress. The man in cell 47 passed through all these phases with textbook precision. He fought the walls during his first year, screamed at guards during his second, fell silent during his third. By year 4, he had achieved what the system defines as successful adaptation, complete compliance with institutional rules, 0 disciplinary infractions, no resistance to authority. He had become the perfect prisoner, psychologically identical to a man who had never lived anywhere except in an 8 by 10-foot concrete box. But the studies missed something crucial, something that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The psychological adaptation that created perfect compliance also created perfect immunity to rehabilitation. Men who adapted completely to the SHU environment became incapable of functioning in any other environment. They had learned to live in concrete boxes so thoroughly that concrete boxes became the only places where they could live. The medical reports document the physical transformation with clinical precision. Vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight, muscle atrophy from restricted movement, sensory processing disorders from monotonous stimulation, sleep disruption from artificial lighting, digestive problems from stress and processed food, cardiovascular deterioration from sedentary lifestyle. The human body, it turns out, requires more than calories and water to function properly. It requires space, movement, variation, contact with the natural world. The man in cell 47 weighs 37 pounds less than when he arrived. His vision has deteriorated from years of artificial lighting. His reflexes have slowed from lack of stimulation. His immune system has weakened from stress and isolation. But these physical changes are minor compared to the psychological transformation documented in reports that no one except the medical staff will ever read. His brain has literally changed shape, neural pathways reorganizing to accommodate a universe 8 feet by 10 feet in dimension. The cost accounting tells its own story. $97,000 annually to house each man in the security housing unit compared to $26,000 for general population. The additional $71,000 pays for the architecture of isolation, thicker walls, electronic locks, specialized staff, redundant security systems. Multiply by 264 inmates, multiply by fiscal years that stretch into decades, and the arithmetic becomes staggering. $3.4 billion spent on the SHU system since 1989. Inflation adjusted, enough money to build 17 community colleges or hire 4,000 teachers for a decade. The most expensive silence in human history, purchased at a cost that exceeds the gross domestic product of small nations. And what has been accomplished with this investment? 264 men who can no longer function in the world that exists beyond concrete walls, psychological adaptation so complete that release has become impossible not because of legal barriers, but because of architectural ones built inside human skulls. The evening count begins at 9:30, the last ritual of a day that has been identical to every day before it and will be identical to every day that follows. Guard Roberts walks the corridor again, counting bodies that occupy the same positions they occupied 16 hours earlier. The lights dim but never disappear. The ventilation system cycles with mechanical precision. The concrete absorbs sound with the efficiency of a tomb. In cell 47, a man lies on a concrete slab covered with a mattress thin enough to fold in half. He has been in this position for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Tomorrow will be 7 years, 3 months, and 17 days. The mathematics are precise. The purpose is absolute control. The cost is everything that makes a human being more than an inventory item in a concrete warehouse built to store broken souls. The machine hums through the night, efficient and unstoppable, producing exactly what it was designed to produce: silence, compliance, and the most expensive emptiness money can buy. In the morning, the cycle will begin again, identical to every morning before it, as predictable as sunrise and twice as indifferent to the lives it illuminates with fluorescent precision. Outside the walls, California sleeps peacefully, secure in the knowledge that dangerous men have been contained. Inside the walls, the security housing unit continues its work with mechanical precision, transforming human beings into perfect prisoners who can never be released, because they can no longer remember how to be anything except what the concrete has made them: shadows of themselves, archived in cells that cost more than houses, maintained at public expense in perpetuity. The machine works perfectly. The question it cannot answer is whether perfect machines designed to control human beings inevitably become perfect machines for destroying them. The morning of August 15, 1993, began like every other morning in the Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit, with mechanical precision and fluorescent lighting that turned human skin the color of old paper. But at 11:17 that morning, something unprecedented happened in the most controlled environment ever constructed by the state of California. A message moved through concrete walls 18 inches thick, traveled past electronic surveillance systems worth millions of dollars, and reached its intended recipient without ever being written down, spoken aloud, or transmitted through any channel that the authorities could monitor or control. The message was simple: 3 taps on a steel door, followed by silence, followed by 3 taps again. In cell C-240, a man named Marcus Williams heard those taps and understood immediately what they meant. Not because anyone had told him, but because the rhythm itself carried meaning older than concrete, deeper than isolation, more persistent than any system designed to prevent human connection. The message was moving, and he was part of its movement. By noon, the message had traveled through 47 cells without anyone speaking a word. By evening, it had crossed into adjacent housing units through a network of communication that existed entirely outside the official architecture of the facility. By midnight, it had reached every member of the Black Guerrilla family housed in the most secure prison in America, coordinating actions that would not take place for months, but required preparation that began immediately. The authorities never detected the message because they never understood what they were trying to detect. They monitored phone calls, intercepted mail, recorded conversations during attorney visits. They installed listening devices in cells, filmed exercise periods, analyzed commissary purchases for patterns that might indicate conspiracy. But they never learned to hear the language that concrete itself had taught to men, with nothing but time and every reason to learn patience. The language was rhythm. 3 taps meant attention. 5 taps meant confirmation. 7 taps meant danger. The spaces between taps carried as much information as the taps themselves. A pause of 3 seconds meant proceed. A pause of 5 seconds meant wait. A pause of 7 seconds meant abort. The concrete that was meant to separate had become a telegraph system, transmitting messages through vibrations that traveled through steel and stone with greater reliability than any electronic communication system ever devised. Marcus Williams had been in the HU for 4 years, 2 months, and 9 days. Long enough to learn the rhythm language. Long enough to understand that isolation was not the absence of communication, but the presence of a different kind of communication, one that operated entirely through patience, repetition, and the slow accumulation of meaning over time. The state had given him nothing but time, and he had learned to use time as a weapon more dangerous than any blade that could be fashioned from prison metal. The message that moved through the walls that August morning concerned something the authorities would later call Operation Midnight Express, though no one inside ever called it anything except the work. The work required coordination between men who had not seen each other for years, who might never see each other again, but who shared something more binding than physical proximity. They shared purpose, refined by isolation until it achieved the hardness of diamond and the precision of surgical steel. The Black Guerrilla family that existed inside the security housing units was not the same organization that had emerged from San Quentin's general population 20 years earlier. Isolation had changed it, refined it, concentrated its ideology until it achieved a purity that would have been impossible in the chaos of normal prison life. The men who led it now were not gang leaders in any conventional sense. They were revolutionaries who had been given unlimited time to think, to plan, to develop strategies that operated on timescales measured in decades rather than months. The revolutionary theory that sustained them had evolved far beyond the Marxist-Leninist principles that had inspired the organization's founding. In the concrete laboratories of the SHU, those principles had been tested against the ultimate example of state oppression, refined through daily experience of absolute powerlessness, and emerged as something harder and more focused than anything that existed in books. They had developed a philosophy of resistance specifically designed for total imprisonment, a way of thinking that could survive any amount of concrete and steel that the state might deploy against it. The state had tried to break them by removing everything that made them human: contact, movement, stimulation, hope. Instead, they had discovered what remained when everything else was taken away. What remained was will, concentrated and purified until it achieved a density that no amount of concrete could contain. The state had created the perfect conditions for the formation of perfect revolutionaries, men who had nothing left to lose because everything had already been taken from them. Operation Midnight Express would take 18 months to execute and would cost the state of California more than $40 million in emergency response, investigation, and institutional lockdown. But its real cost would be measured in the complete collapse of faith in the security housing unit as a solution to the problem of organized resistance. The operation would prove that no amount of concrete could contain an idea whose time had come, and that the most expensive silence in history could not prevent the coordination of men who had learned to communicate through the language of concrete itself. The planning for the operation took place in cells scattered across 5 different security housing units, coordinated by men who had not spoken to each other for years, but who shared a communication network more sophisticated than anything the authorities imagined possible. The network operated through rhythm, routine, and the careful observation of patterns that only long-term isolation could teach. A guard who walked his rounds 3 minutes late, a food delivery that arrived with different timing, a mechanical sound that lasted longer than usual. Each variation carried meaning for men who had learned to read the institutional environment with the precision of seismologists studying earthquake data. The operation itself would be elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. On a date that would be coordinated through rhythm messages tapped through concrete walls, every BGF member in administrative segregation would refuse food simultaneously, not just at one facility, but at every security housing unit in California. The hunger strike would continue until the state met specific demands regarding prison conditions, visiting rights, and access to educational materials. But the real purpose of the operation was not to achieve those demands. The real purpose was to demonstrate that the security housing unit had failed in its fundamental mission. It had not broken the organization it was designed to destroy. The hunger strike would succeed not because the state sympathized with the strikers' demands, but because the state could not afford the publicity that would result from prisoners dying of starvation in facilities that cost $97,000 per inmate annually to operate. The media attention would force official acknowledgement that organized resistance existed inside the most secure prisons in America, that isolation had not achieved its intended purpose, and that the entire philosophy underlying the security housing unit was based on assumptions that had proven false. But the preparation for the operation revealed something that even the organizers had not fully understood. The rhythm language that allowed coordination across concrete walls had become more than a communication system. It had become a form of consciousness, a way of thinking that operated entirely through patience and collective purpose. The men who planned Operation Midnight Express were no longer individuals making personal decisions. They had become components of a larger intelligence that existed distributed across hundreds of concrete cells, thinking thoughts that no single person could think, making decisions that transcended personal interest or individual survival. The state had created the conditions for the emergence of a collective consciousness that operated through the infrastructure of imprisonment itself. The concrete walls, the steel doors, the electronic surveillance systems, all of it had become the nervous system of an intelligence that the architects of control had never imagined possible. The security housing unit had become not just a prison, but a machine for the evolution of resistance, generating forms of organization that could not exist anywhere except under conditions of total repression. The guards who walked the corridors of the SHU during the 18 months of planning noticed nothing unusual. The men in the cells maintained perfect compliance with institutional rules. Disciplinary infractions dropped to nearly zero. Violence disappeared entirely. The facility operated with mechanical precision, generating reports that praised the success of the administrative segregation model. Meanwhile, through the rhythm language that moved through concrete walls, the most complex prison operation in California history was being planned by men who had been given nothing but time and every reason to use that time effectively. The irony was lost on no one except the officials who would later investigate the operation and conclude that security procedures needed to be strengthened, surveillance systems needed to be upgraded, and isolation protocols needed to be more strictly enforced. They would spend millions of dollars on technological solutions to a problem they fundamentally misunderstood. They thought they were dealing with a communication problem when they were actually dealing with a consciousness problem. They thought they could prevent coordination when they had actually created the conditions for a form of coordination that transcended anything that normal communication could achieve. The rhythm language continued to evolve, becoming more sophisticated as the months passed. Complex messages could be transmitted through variations in timing, intensity, and repetition that carried multiple layers of meaning. The concrete that was meant to separate had become a medium for the transmission of intelligence that operated according to principles no prison architect had ever considered. The state had built the perfect machine for preventing communication and had accidentally created the perfect machine for evolving it. By the spring of 1994, the Black Guerrilla family and the security housing units had developed organizational capabilities that surpassed anything that existed in general population. The isolation that was meant to break them had instead given them the time and focus necessary to solve problems of coordination that had never been solved by any other prison organization. They had learned to think collectively, to plan patiently, and to execute operations that operated on timescales that exceeded the attention spans of their captors. The men who would execute Operation Midnight Express were no longer prisoners in any meaningful sense. They had become components of a resistance machine that the state had unwittingly constructed through its own attempts to achieve absolute control. The concrete walls that contained their bodies had become the infrastructure for a form of consciousness that no amount of concrete could contain. The state had achieved perfect physical imprisonment and had discovered that perfect physical imprisonment was the ideal condition for the development of perfect psychological freedom. The machine was working exactly as designed. The question was whether the state understood what it had designed, whether the architects of control had any comprehension of what they had actually built in their concrete laboratories of human experimentation. The answer would come when the rhythm language finally translated into action, when the collective consciousness that had evolved in isolation finally made itself known to the world beyond concrete walls. The countdown had begun, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the patient rhythm of taps that moved through 18 inches of reinforced concrete, carrying messages that would reshape the entire philosophy of imprisonment in America. The state had built the perfect cage and had discovered that perfect cages were the ideal conditions for the evolution of perfect resistance. The revolution had already begun. The authorities just hadn't learned to hear its rhythm yet. The helicopter lifted off from Sacramento at dawn on the morning of October 27, 1994, carrying emergency response teams to 5 different facilities across California. The radio chatter was terse, professional, and increasingly desperate. At Pelican Bay, 216 inmates had refused breakfast. At Corcoran, 143. At Tehachapi, 79. At Salinas Valley, 98. At California State Prison, Los Angeles County, 154. By noon, the numbers had not changed. Not a single inmate had broken. Not a single demand had been negotiated. Not a single weakness had revealed itself in what prison administrators were beginning to recognize as the most coordinated operation in the history of American corrections. The Black Guerrilla family had just demonstrated that 18 inches of reinforced concrete could not prevent the kind of organization that emerges when human beings have unlimited time to think and every reason to act. The hunger strike was entering its first day, but the crisis had been building for months without anyone in authority recognizing what they were seeing. The warning signs had been there, hidden in plain sight within the bureaucratic machinery that generated thousands of pages of reports but never generated understanding. Commissary purchases had declined gradually across all security housing units. Medical requests for antacids and digestive aids had increased. Sleep patterns had shifted in ways that suggested preparation for extended stress. But each facility reported these changes separately, and no one at the state level thought to look for patterns that crossed institutional boundaries. The failure of intelligence was complete and systematic. The state had invested millions of dollars in surveillance technology capable of detecting whispered conversations through concrete walls, but had never developed the analytical capability to recognize the coordination of silence. They had monitored every phone call, intercepted every letter, recorded every attorney visit. They had documented every disciplinary infraction, cataloged every medical complaint, tracked every commissary purchase. The data was perfect. The understanding was non-existent. In conference rooms across Sacramento, emergency meetings produced nothing except confusion and recrimination. How had 690 inmates across 5 maximum security facilities coordinated simultaneous action without anyone detecting the preparation? How had men locked in isolation 23 hours daily developed operational capabilities that exceeded those of most military units? How had the most monitored population in America executed the most complex operation in corrections history while remaining completely invisible to the most sophisticated surveillance system ever deployed against civilian prisoners? The answer was hiding in the rhythm language that moved through concrete walls, but no one in authority had learned to hear that language because no one in authority had ever experienced the kind of isolation that teaches patience measured in years rather than days. The officials who designed the security housing units understood concrete and steel with engineering precision, but they had never understood that human consciousness, when compressed by isolation, achieves densities that no physical material can match. Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychiatrist contracted to evaluate hunger strikers for medical intervention, arrived at Pelican Bay on the afternoon of October 28th to find something that her training had not prepared her to understand. The striking inmates were not exhibiting the psychological profiles associated with either suicide attempts or protest actions. They were calm, focused, and psychologically stable. They answered questions with clarity and coherence. They expressed no anger toward guards or administrators. They showed no signs of the depression or anxiety that typically accompany extended isolation. Instead, they exhibited what Dr. Chen would later describe in her confidential report as revolutionary serenity, a psychological state characterized by absolute certainty of purpose, complete acceptance of consequence, and total commitment to collective action that transcended individual survival. They were not striking because they were desperate. They were striking because they had achieved a form of consciousness that made anything except striking impossible. The medical protocols for hunger strike management had been developed for individuals acting alone, driven by personal grievances or psychological instability. They assumed that isolation would weaken resolve, that time would erode commitment, that the basic human drive for survival would eventually overcome whatever ideology motivated the initial action. But these protocols proved useless when applied to men who had learned to think collectively, who measured time in years rather than days, and who understood survival in terms that had nothing to do with individual biology. By the 5th day, the strike had generated media attention that forced Governor Pete Wilson to convene a crisis management team that included corrections officials, legal advisors, medical experts, and public relations specialists. The team met in emergency session to confront a problem that had no precedent in American corrections. How do you negotiate with an organization that officially does not exist, that operates through communication channels you cannot monitor, and that has demonstrated operational capabilities that your own intelligence systems cannot explain? The state's initial response revealed the complete bankruptcy of official understanding. They offered concessions on visiting schedules, library access, and recreation time, benefits that assumed the strikers were motivated by conditions rather than ideology. The offers were ignored completely. No counter-proposals were submitted. No negotiations were requested. The silence was more deafening than any rejection could have been, because it demonstrated that the state fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. The Black Guerrilla family was not protesting prison conditions. They were demonstrating the failure of prison as a concept. The hunger strike was not an attempt to improve their circumstances. It was a proof of principle, evidence that no amount of concrete and steel could prevent the formation of revolutionary consciousness when that consciousness was given sufficient time to develop. They were not asking for reform. They were announcing that the entire system of administrative segregation had become counterproductive to its own stated purposes. The economic pressure mounted with each passing day. Emergency medical monitoring cost the state $14,000 daily per striker. Additional security personnel added another $8,000 per day per facility. Emergency food preparation for inmates who might break the strike cost $6,000 daily across all locations. Legal consultation and crisis management added another $12,000 daily in administrative costs. The total expense exceeded $40,000 per day, with no resolution in sight and no clear understanding of how long the strike might continue. But the real cost was political. Media coverage had attracted attention from civil rights organizations, political activists, and academic researchers who began asking uncomfortable questions about the entire philosophy of supermaximum security imprisonment. How much money should a democratic society spend to isolate human beings so completely that they develop revolutionary consciousness as an adaptive response? What did it mean for public safety when the most expensive prisons in America appeared to be producing exactly the opposite of their intended effect? The questions were particularly uncomfortable because they could not be answered without acknowledging the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the security housing unit system. The facilities had been designed to break organized resistance by breaking the human capacity for organization itself. But isolation, when applied to intelligent people with strong ideological convictions, had precisely the opposite effect. It concentrated their intelligence, strengthened their convictions, and provided them with unlimited time to develop organizational strategies that could survive any amount of repression. On the 8th day, 3 strikers at Corcoran were hospitalized for dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. The media coverage intensified. Civil rights attorneys filed emergency motions for medical intervention. Politicians began making statements that revealed their complete ignorance of the issues involved. Everyone wanted the strike to end, but no one understood what would be required to end it because no one understood what had caused it to begin. Dr. Chen's medical reports documented a phenomenon that challenged every assumption underlying the administrative segregation model. The striking inmates were not suffering from the psychological deterioration typically associated with hunger strikes. Instead, they exhibited heightened mental clarity, increased emotional stability, and improved cognitive function. They were not weakening under the stress of starvation. They were becoming stronger, more focused, more committed to their cause with each passing day. The explanation was as simple as it was devastating to official policy. The hunger strike was not a protest action undertaken by individuals acting in isolation. It was a collective ritual performed by men who had learned to think as components of a larger intelligence. They were not starving themselves. They were participating in a form of communion that transformed individual suffering into collective strength, personal sacrifice into shared purpose, physical weakness into psychological power. The state had created the conditions for this transformation by isolating men so completely that they had no choice except to discover what remained when everything else was taken away. What remained was consciousness itself, not individual consciousness constrained by personal interest and biological limitation, but collective consciousness that operated according to principles that transcended individual survival. The hunger strike was the first visible manifestation of this collective consciousness. But it would not be the last. On the 11th day, the strike expanded. Inmates who had not been members of the Black Guerrilla family began refusing food in solidarity with the original strikers. The operation had transcended its original boundaries and was becoming something larger, more dangerous, and completely beyond the state's capacity to understand or control. The rhythm language that moved through concrete walls was now carrying messages that reached beyond the BGF network, coordinating action among inmates with no previous organizational affiliation. The expansion proved what prison administrators had feared but never acknowledged. The Security Housing Unit had not prevented the formation of revolutionary consciousness, it had perfected it. The isolation that was meant to break organized resistance had instead created the ideal conditions for its evolution into something more sophisticated, more dangerous, and more persistent than anything the authorities had imagined possible. Emergency meetings in Sacramento produced increasingly desperate proposals: cut off all commissary privileges, eliminate recreation time entirely, install additional surveillance equipment, transfer the strike leaders to even more isolated facilities. Each proposal revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding: the belief that more repression could solve problems created by repression itself. The officials who managed California's prison system had become trapped in a logic that led nowhere except toward escalating control measures that would inevitably produce escalating resistance. On the 14th day, the first death occurred. Marcus Williams, the man in cell C-240 who had received the first rhythm message 18 months earlier, was found unconscious during the morning count and pronounced dead 37 minutes later at the facility medical unit. The autopsy would later reveal that he had died not from starvation, but from the intersection of extended isolation, prolonged stress, and the physical demands of maintaining revolutionary consciousness under conditions designed to destroy it. His death changed everything and nothing. The other strikers received the news through the rhythm language and responded with intensified commitment rather than weakened resolve. The state received the news through official channels and responded with panic that produced no effective action. The media received the news through press releases and responded with coverage that asked all the right questions while providing none of the right answers. Marcus Williams had died in the most expensive prison cell in America, killed not by violence or neglect, but by the accumulated weight of concrete and ideology pressing against each other until something had to break. The state had spent $97,000 annually for 4 years, 2 months, and 9 days to house him in conditions that had transformed him into something they could neither understand nor control. His death was the first casualty of a war between architecture and consciousness, concrete and ideology, the machinery of control and the uncontainable human capacity to imagine freedom. The hunger strike continued for 37 more days, ending not because the state met the strikers' demands, but because the collective consciousness that had organized it determined that the demonstration had achieved its purpose. The point had been made. The Security Housing Unit had been revealed as a failure by its own standards. The most expensive silence in human history had been proven incapable of silencing the ideas it had been designed to destroy. The crisis had cost California $42 million in emergency response, medical intervention, legal fees, and administrative chaos, but the real cost would be measured in the complete loss of faith in administrative segregation as a solution to the problem of organized resistance. The state had built the perfect machine for breaking human beings, and had discovered that perfect machines for breaking human beings inevitably produce perfect reasons for revolution. The concrete walls still stood, the steel doors still locked, the surveillance systems still recorded, but everyone who had witnessed the hunger strike understood that something fundamental had changed. The Security Housing Unit would continue to operate, but it would never again operate with the confidence that isolation could prevent organization, that concrete could contain consciousness, or that any amount of steel and stone could restrain the human capacity to imagine and create alternatives to the systems designed to control them.